Silas, my friend, good evening.
Good evening.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. I'm doing great. I can't complain, you know. Nobody will listen. Perhaps some of our listeners will be willing to listen to me complain, but I doubt it. Just quick, sorry to cut across, a quick point there. On our last discussion, we touched upon the cliphotic element of the Kabbalah, and I think in the conversation we were suggesting in our next chat, which is this chat, we would discuss this concept of postmodernism as a kind of a cultural weapon. I wonder, can you give any type of an overview or introductory or even summary kind of base knowledge as to what this area entails and what is the basic, what kind of are we talking about in a basic sense?
Well, to be really, really general about the definition of postmodernism, and again, sort of defining postmodernism is rather one could say, an impossible task, but I will try. If you look at Theodor Adorno's work, he was a Weimar Republic, or in a general sense, a German philosopher who came out of the Goethe University of Frankfurt. It was a sort of new perspective, what they termed a third way. They were sort of disillusioned by Marxism, capitalism, even fascism at that time as well. Though, funnily enough, they sort of came from a Marxist perspective, I would say. I would argue, but potentially that could be bias on my part. But nonetheless, he developed a theory called critical theory. Essentially, it's hyper-criticism of power structures, and also, I would say, again, if I was to be reductionist about it, that they're attempting to find oppression where there is none, that they're chasing ghosts. So primarily that's what it's about, identifying power structures, critiquing them out of existence. That evolved within the 60s. You had Foucault, Lyotard, in terms of their evolution of postmodernism. We'll probably touch upon that. But it's really based around, in terms of the development of it now, contemporary development up to this point, it centres around what one would call pluralism or eclecticism, meaning, well, for example, postmodern architecture. Just to take for instance, it's the new sort of international architecture, or the standard for it is a blend. It's a quote quote diverse blend. Uh, I mean, if I was critique it myself, I would say it's a sort of tasteless, bland, formless mass or blob. It really destroys every other component or part of the diversity within what it does. But that would just be my critique of it. But it's also self-referential. So, in essence, one could visualize that by the Ouroboros or the snake eating itself. It really is we're seeing today in terms of intersectionalism. We'll probably get into that. That's something that's developed from critical theory. You find a lot of circular logic. So, in essence, that's what self-referentialism is in the modern concept of postmodernism. But yes, it's really centered around a sort of hypercritical skepticism.
We mentioned last week in our kind of discussion around the cliphotic kind of realms of the Kabbalah, this notion of the Samael sphere, as it were, whereby the left-hand path occultist would reimagine the world in his or her, to his or her vision, as it were, with a view to becoming a god as such. So is there some correlation there between this postmodernist Frankfurt School mentality of sort of critical theory, where one reduces the current reality into micro components and then obliterates it altogether with a view to recreating society or modernity, to their kind of recipe, as it were.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Postmodernism as well is mainly centered around the idea that the human experience itself is a target of, ironically, dehumanization, meaning that they see it as a social construct. Why do they see it as a social construct? This sort of ties back in with our previous discussion. They see it as a social construct, or, for example, they critique God in the Kabbalistic sense, or demean his status, primarily because if something is relative, epistemologically relative, or morally relative, or any sort of relativity, then there is room, there's space to reimagine it, as you're saying. But it is all based around power. So again, that, as we were talking about the sort of cliff off, these individuals could be seen as the rebellious, adversarial, antithetical motion to, or force to life itself. They are anti-life. But yes, indeed, there is a connection there. I would even go as far to say, given Horkheimer and Adorno, of the Frankfurt School, they're the primary proponents of it, or leaders of it. I would probably wager that they're, if I was to be conspiratorial about it, they're probably connected in some way to the cabal or this cult that seem to be in power at the moment. If I was if I was to be speculative about it, yes.
Well, it's a passing observation which may or may not be relevant, but we do take note that the Frankfurt School, as it were, was originally began with the Institute for Social Research at the Goethe University in Frankfurt in 1929. But we do make note really that Goethe has his own connections, shall we say, with occult elements, perhaps, or what we might term Masonic elements, etc. And also, Steiner, of note, Steiner was an acolyte of Goethe. So these characters before the Frankfurt School, it would seem that we have these connections or question marks or areas that would perhaps need to be explored fully. And the reason is, Silas, just let's be clear here. The Frankfurt School really is a collection of academic thinkers, social critics, perhaps economists, people who have ideas around the social organization of human beings, around how government should be organized, etc., how society should be organized. But they really are a think tank or a group of intellectuals who have arisen out of Marxism. But ultimately, we are, like, the terminology Frankfurt School. The picture we have in our head is of an actual school, an actual institution, which is quite definable. But it would seem that it would have tentacles that were very very far-reaching, and have had a huge impact on how modern society is shaped. How do you feel about that, or any thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. Just as a quick point on Goethe. So, in terms of postmodernism, well, they do state they typically do not like the sort of diametric opposite to it, as it's officially presented, as would be modernism and also the Enlightenment thinking. However, within the Enlightenment sort of philosophy, if you will, and modernism, there is an idea that's coined by postmodernists termed the meta-narrative. In essence, that which society or any social group is working towards, the sort of overreaching goal. They deny that. However, in the same breath, there's a great deal of them, and I mean, we're even seeing it today, that discuss this idea of the new man. So, for example, even the sort of Marxists that were, one could say, culturally and mentally, philosophically infected by postmodern ideals within the 60s, 70s, for example, Pol Pot, they sought to do away with the history, to do away with the culture, the art. You saw it in Mao's China. They totally eviscerate any collective sense of identity because they wish to create the new man. So how does this link with Goethe? Well, Goethe had probably going to put a section on this within my book, but he discusses this idea of I think it's called the typus. Now, if I recall correctly, the typus is a sort of, again, the same idea as postmodernism, the new man, the new utopia, the remade man, even Nietzsche stated it, the Übermensch. Kabbalah has a similar thing, the Adam Kadmon, and what have you. This idea of man remade anew, something better, higher. So that's something that seems to tie them fundamentally together, sort of common intellectual thread.
Appropriation or insert into culture or change in culture, the use of intellectualism as a weapon, really, in a more general sense.
So I mean, everything we're seeing now, it's all about breaking down identity, individual and collective identity. Again, it's all about criticizing things until they fall apart. This, in essence, goes back to psychological warfare. And even, funnily enough, one could say postmodernism really formalized the technique of mimetic warfare. Especially Horkheimer discusses it, Adorno discusses it, this sort of the collective identity and how it can be changed. He discusses something, if I recall, regarding the cultural industry. If I recall correctly, he states that most people are uncreative, hence why they view movies, they view media, consume it, simply because they don't have the creative will to create their own fantasies, or they don't have the imagination, if you will. I would disagree with that, but that's something he stated. Again, that is, as one can imagine, that theoretically leads on to, in a sort of continuum, leads on to mimetic warfare. Because if people are generally without any will, and it's all based on imitation and mimicry, and from that it sets the societal standard, then one can easily set the societal standard by steering, much like cybernetics, steering the social mimicry by inputting mimetic ideas into the psyche. One could say that's probably why the internet was brought forth into the cultural zeitgeist and obviously the technological zeitgeist, because it allows for the free movement of these mimetic ideas, if you will. And as we're seeing, the changes are becoming rapid within society. That's because I think they really have formalized the techniques of mimetic warfare, which essentially is psychological warfare. But yes, it's all about breaking down the barriers, the liminal barriers within society, remaking them, and essentially boxing people into a corner. And from that, they will create a centralized utopian structure. I think that's probably the end goal of postmodernism, even though most of the intellectuals don't. I think intellectuals mostly just like criticizing things. They like seeing the bigger picture in things. If something's given to them, such as postmodernism, where they state, well, these are the power structures, they're oppressing people, this is the bigger picture. Most intellectuals jump on that like pardon the phrase, like a bitch on heat. And through mimetics as well, the intellectuals have sort of been captured by this.
Well, the genesis of this movement, like, there seems to be. I'm a little bit. I wonder if you can kind of help me to get my head around this, because the Frankfurt School, to me, as I understand it, seemed to be a think tank that was trying to rescue Marxist ideology, because the prediction of the class warfare kind of scenario where society would break down, that Marx had made, had not happened. So the Frankfurt School came up with a theory that the reason it had not happened is that society was being spoon-fed a kind of a fake culture through what they Horkheimer and co entitled or called the culture industry. And so the idea of attacking this kind of the moral and intellectual center within the West was as a kind of a tactical means to destroy what had prevented the revolution from happening. It was designed to destroy society, or the social kind of cultural life of society, which had proved to be an obstacle in the way of, the Marxist revolution, as it were. So this Frankfurt School kind of concept is a weaponized way, an intellectual weapon, essentially designed to remove this cultural kind of these artifacts that had come gotten in the way. But it seems to me that when one looks at these things, Silas, we're talking about Marx, and we eventually end up talking about communism. But can we make a distinction between these things and globalism? Because it seems to me that this entire movement has been co-opted, or they are the useful idiots for globalism. And that when you pick it apart, that you're no longer left with Marx, you're no longer left with any kind of class struggle. All that stuff gets swept aside, and we're now into the hyper-modern kind of globalist battlefield, as it were. And all this Frankfurt School stuff, all has been used, has been weaponized, ultimately to fragment society. And they've been aided and abetted, it would seem to me, by globalist forces. But that the end result for the Frankfurt School kind of side of things originally was a socialist / communist ideal, whereas the goal from the globalist point of view is different. They're looking for complete hegemony, a reimagining of society, and they've merely co-opted the Frankfurt School kind of ideology as a means to their end. Would you comment on that, or can you see a distinction between them?
Oh, I absolutely agree. Yes, most of these individuals are useful idiots, even within the infancy of Marxism. Probably Marx and Engels. Well, maybe not Engels, but definitely Marx. He wasn't the individual everyone made him out to be. Even the right wing give him too much credit. Primarily, it was Engels. But yes, most of the revolutionaries that were centered around them, they were useful idiots. The entire ideology as well is something based around an inferiority complex, one could say, of one class, pitting one class against the other as well. And obviously that is designed, again, as a sort of object of temptation, ideologically speaking, to get useful idiots on board with a movement that was designed to gradually, like a sort of social cancer, slowly eat away at the edifice of Western civilization, or whatever term we wish to use. Fast forward into, again, the intellectuals that were born out of the Frankfurt School. I mean, even the Frankfurt School, and I totally agree, there was a great deal of Marxists involved in it. Primarily it was Marxism. It was pushing what would be termed cultural Marxism, which probably originated with Gramsci, an Italian communist. His ideas about why violent revolution just would not work within Europe. Therefore, they needed to move to psychological warfare. That warfare which is difficult to pinpoint and also combat by, the conventional means. Fast forward into today, you've slowly seen them. They're using useful idiots. Antifa are useful idiots. Even the people on the TV, most of them are sort of captured by these postmodern, and they're not really even. Postmodernism is merely just a term that was invented, I think, by probably these this cult, this cabal, the sort of movers and shakers, the magnates, the power, if you will. One could call them the corporations. People have many different names for them. But yes, this cabal, I think postmodernism was integral in instituting, or inducing, the chaos within the societal sphere that is a requisite to this new system that we see coming into view. So, the World Economic Forum is a direct intellectual successor to the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School, funnily enough, though they were primarily Marxist, though there were some in it looking for a third way, what was born out of that was what would be termed a sort of progressive political movement or ideology. That which we see now, but back then it was in its nascent stages within the 30s and 20s and 30s and 40s. But yes, many other things grew out of that too. The cybernetic movement, general moral relativism grew out of that, which has given birth to everything we see. That they don't see strict, objective truth. So therefore everything's up for grabs in terms of being modified and culturally eroded via the corrosive force of what we would term as postmodernism. But again, in a way, even that's a sort of generalized term. I think it's grew into something more. You know, like a cancer spreads throughout a body, metastasizes, and eventually mutates and evolves into various branches. I think a similar thing has occurred here.
Well, in relation to that kind of metaphor of the cancer, I put it to you that the original tumor, the crisis wound from which the infection entered the corporeal system, as it were, was World War One and World War Two. I put it to you, and I put it to you that the gas chamber and the guilt and self-hate and the existential kind of moral crisis that was in the Western psyche after World War Two opened the door for all this moral relativism and this breakdown of what we might have called traditional logos or natural law, and it left us into this labyrinth of where we became lost. And it seemed at that time for Western society that this new postmodernist critical theory, that it appealed to us in a sense, in a dark moment, like a drug or like a lighthouse, that it seemed to shine at a certain point when we were at our lowest, when we had lost millions through warfare, where we had turned against each other along the basis of religious lines, or the lines of political ideologies, etc., etc. So, do you see that? Would you agree that this crept in when we were at our lowest, at our worst point?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, even we can see the Frankfurt School themselves were born out of Weimar Germany. Now, people, people don't really understand how pervasive the societal rot or corruption was in Weimar Germany. I mean, it was such a terrible time that birthed the National Socialist movement and even the Communist movement, where there was many revolutions there, most prominent being the Bavarian Soviet Socialist Republic. Or people were looking for anything, any sort of alternative. That was occurring throughout Europe. I mean, most of the, one could say, the sort of world island, if you will. It was occurring mostly there, because obviously the war had so ravaged the industry and workforce of Europe. There was social, and obviously a lot of the men were returning shell shocked. So there was vast social, mental health issues, a great deal of impoverishment. It really was a terrible time. Yes, I would agree. During that sort of weak point, people were self-reflecting. I mean, even probably in a subconscious sense, and thinking, what is the point of this sort of jingoistic imperialism? And they were looking for any sort of way out. And again, they sort of drifted gradually towards eroding and critiquing their own culture from that. Yes, from our low point, which one could say was probably artificially created, that entire war, both of them, World War I and World War II. From that was created the conditions, the social conditions, to grow this sort of embryonic cancer. It was contained within the Frankfurt School. Obviously the Frankfurt School as well, coming up to the advent of World War II, I'm pretty sure they migrated to, it might have been New York. I'm pretty sure it was somewhere in the US. I think it was on the East Coast somewhere. I think it was New York. And obviously, with the cultural industry that was already well established in New York, they could, fast track this, again, mimetic warfare, this social cancer that they were wishing to unleash upon the public.
Just very quickly there, to reference your point about World War II, World War One and World War II perhaps being set up to happen, rather. I know the book that I've come across recently, Conjuring Hitler by Guido Giacomo Preparata. It's worth a read for anyone who's interested in this idea that World War One and World War Two were essentially staged, managed from without, and the Weimar Treaty, etc. Globalist kind of cabal agenda had encircled Germany and caused it to collapse essentially from within, and then had stealthily funded aspects of National Socialism, which then gave them the eventual excuse to pulverize Germany for once and for all. And I think that's a fairly bombastic concept. Are you familiar with that kind of stuff, Silas, or have you come across that in your travels?
I haven't come across that specific book, but I've looked at, I mean, even the sort of rise of National Socialism. I have quite a great deal of critique surrounding some of the just really perplexing issues of it. So, for example, post-dating the Munich Putsch, or the revolution, if you will, in Munich in 1923, if I recall, where obviously the National Socialist movement, headed by Adolf Hitler at the time, attempted to seize power and create a Bavarian National Socialist regime. Well, under Weimar law, he should have been shot as a traitor to the Weimar Republic. Once all unravelled, he was taken to court. He wasn't. He was put in, well, it was pretty much house arrest. But yes, that's where obviously he wrote Mein Kampf. Yes, so, I mean, that just doesn't make sense. That right away, that tells you there was a conspiracy to keep sort of Hitler going, if you will. I honestly think a lot of the bureaucracy in the West probably wished Hitler to take power, probably funded him for the same reason, to create a buffer state between themselves and, at that time, the military expansionist Soviet Union. Obviously, they just failed invading Poland at the time. So I think that was probably the military and political bureaucracy in the West's idea surrounding Hitler. Obviously, higher up echelons in the West, I'm almost sure of it, that there was some sort of orchestration of a bigger plan surrounding him in terms of keeping him alive and funding him. I'm almost sure of it.
Well, very, very briefly, my understanding around Preparata's thesis is that the objective was to destroy Germany for once and for all, and so that Germany would no longer pose an imperial threat to the British Empire. And the concept, there was a British strategic concept in the late 19th century, which the thinking was whoever held the mainland in Europe, the central land, if they were to make a political military alliance with then Tsarist Russia, that structure would go on to control the world. So at all costs, that had to be stopped. So then that formulated the strategy to insert communism into Russia and to get rid of the Tsar and control it essentially from without. And to destroy Germany, you needed a good excuse to destroy a European nation. So what you had to do was to prod it until it fell on its knees, and eventually this nationalist movement materializes. We have this Lance Corporal, a nowhere man, a failed artist, an unemployed painter of postcards, goes on to try to take over the world. So it's absolutely fantastic stuff. But this is what we're told in school. It was as simple as this, and then the good guys came in and saved the day, and Germany, as was completely obliterated. And but I think one important point that I think we may need to try and get our heads around is that psychologically in the West, the fallout from the destruction of Germany, the rise of National Socialism, and the essential final triumph of the Allied powers over what was Germany, sent a message deep into the Western psyche that any kind of movement towards nationalism, self-determination, or the sort of, any nation who would attempt to put itself on its own feet, that would be seen to be contrary to the globalist agenda, would be met with, they'd be destroyed. So I think this has left a huge message in the Western psyche. and it hasn't quite been explored. But the fall guys for this stuff was Germany, and we've all learned that you just don't do that now. That's not done, and any self determination, any nationalist sentiment ends in automatically in the gas chamber, and there's no way, and that guilt is in our psyche, and that sense of horror is embedded in us. That self hate is embedded in us. It was from that self hate and that guilt that we searched in that darkness for a beacon of light, and that beacon was critical theory, because the self hate led to the destruction of everything around us. It was, as you to use your metaphor, the cancer. It was the original tumor, and from that, the cells multiplied and it invaded the body, so to speak. I think that what happened with Germany is a key moment in modernity, is a turning point, I think. How do you feel about that?
That was the reasoning behind it. You're absolutely correct. I mean, one could even say they're doing the same thing right now in terms of Russia, to sort of continue to propel that idea, to dissuade people against, nationalism, or even self-determination, or, sovereignty of oneself and one's nation. They're building this idea of, Putin. I mean, even China. They're building this idea of them as, they're sort of trying to go back to those days of yore, where this nationalist fervor, this sort of jingoistic fervor, as you say, ends in quote massacres and what have you, is going to return. Again, that's why a lot of the progressives are flung their hat in for Ukraine, even though Ukraine actually has some, really extremist elements within it that are, one could say, diametrically opposite to these individuals in the West that would self-style as progressives. But I totally agree with you. That's probably the reason it was created, from a higher sort of perspective, or from the inner circle downwards. They wished to create a diametric ideological opposite to what they were wishing to propagate within the body of the West. Again, the cancer. So they had to do that for people to look at nationalism, that which cures this cancer. That they wished for people to look at that with disdain and a deep sense of hatred and an aversion to it, to the point, as you're saying now, this mimetic idea, this guilt, this fear of it, has been conditioned into us, and potentially they're continuing that conditioning via what's happening over in Eastern Europe, and even within the Indo-Pacific region, and the way they're painting out Russia and China to be within the Western media. So yes, I think you're absolutely on point with that.
Is it fair to say that nationalism then is dead, and Adolf Hitler put the bullet in it, like that? It simply doesn't exist. It can't exist in any moral thinking person can't even contemplate it, that it's gone. And it is one of the threads that were pulled to get into the postmodernist era, post-nation, because we can't think of nation now. We can't. It's morally abhorrent. So is it dead altogether? Is it gone and buried?
I would say on a macro level, our nationalism died, or has died, because our nations have died. We're no longer nations, from the Latin meaning tribe, essentially. We no longer act as communities anymore. We're basically a collection of atomized individuals. Again, postmodernism, this idea of diversity, pluralism, this grey man, or formless edifice, this insipid machination of the minds of lunatics, essentially. It's bland. Again, the NPC meme actually fits extremely well in terms of what they've created. Again, they've put everyone into a sort of blender, and what's came out is a grey goo. So, unfortunately, but however, I wish to say, once, because this sort of goes into what I was writing within my first book regarding the age of intellect, and you sort of see these this sort of hypercriticalism, and it does end with the fall and destruction of the civilization, not without, but from within, internally, within the body populace. But I really do think there's going to be a growth, a localized growth of nationalism, at least before the final sort of death throes of the West, if you know, this civilization. And I think there will be a rebirth of nationalism. It will again take that, enter a sort of synthesis stage where it will dispel of both the thesis and the antithesis and become something new and grander. I do think there will be a return to nationalism, but a better nationalism, I think. One that, can withstand this postmodern critique, at least for, I would say, at least for 2 centuries, or maybe more, hopefully.
So can we reimagine nationalism for the postmodernist era? Can we have a postmodernist nationalism, perhaps whereby we don't have any flag, or we don't have a national border, but that we do have an alliance, perhaps amongst people who are thinking in like-minded ways. Perhaps I'm just trying to intimate on what you're saying there, that there could be a new format. It could take a new identity or new way of being. What do you think?
Well, I was meaning more. It's more resilient. It's more resilient in terms of one could say the sort of meta thinking, how people view postmodernism and all this, other various concepts that are born out of it. This intersectionalism and critical theory, that people see through it, and thus they have sort of built up an intellectual and mental immunity to it. But I do agree. I think it will go beyond mere sort of, one could say, flag worship, that we will no longer worship the flag. We will worship the very land, the people. That shall be the new nationalism. That we won't worship the monarch or the ruler. We won't invest in him all of our hopes, our dreams, and that which we find to be the ideals of our nation. We shall find that within the very soil itself, in the blood itself, whatever form that may take. And I think that creates the more resilient form of nationalism, and I would say the far more versatile or flexible form as well, to any adaptations or changes within the geopolitical environment, should we say.
Well, I feel, are we very far from that point if we've been so atomized and broken apart, and our consciousness is become, things have become so relative, and we seem so lost. Are we very, very far from that point?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That will take a collapse, but fortunately for
Mm.
us, that it seems to be fast approaching, like a train hurtling towards us. So honestly,
Mm.
I do. There is a storm coming, obviously, but like that old Latin phrase goes, once the storm passes, the sun emerges. So I do think there is a better future on the horizon for us all. Things can
Mm.
only get better, as they say. So that's what I think.
What about us atomized individuals, as it were, the likes of perhaps yourself, myself, perhaps people listening to us talking right now? Is there some? Do we play a role in all this? Are we the transnational nation, as it were? Are we the new digital nation, the digital consciousness? Are we have we some identity here? Or is there perhaps some role for us to play in, shall we say, use the military terms, mobilizing or organizing? Or is there some, might we fulfill some
I
function, do you
like that
think?
term, transnational nation. That is a good term. Yes, it's a sort of spiritual connection we have, which is
Mm.
even, I mean it. That's the sort of resilient nationalism I'm talking about, where we don't think
Mm.
of the sort of brittle and rigid
Mhm.
nationalism of the past. Again, the sort of flag worship and invest in all of our hopes and dreams, and one could say a sort of parsimonious or corruptible leader, if you will, that we take on higher form of nationalism, that we become more spiritual. We find it within, I mean, not even just our blood, and not even within our mentality, but our very spirit, that we are sort of, could say, bound to each other in terms of our hopes and our dreams, and in the future that we wish to to create. I think most of us here have the same sort of common idea or vision of the future that we wish for, that we wish to live in peace and harmony, and we don't wish to essentially be looking over our backs every 2 minutes at incessant threats from within and from without. And we wish to create a future that is prosperous and stable for our progeny. I mean, I think that's a sort of universal thing throughout the world. And I think really from nationalism, you can build world peace. I think that is the only way to build world peace. Rather than internationalism, which really pits, as you're seeing right now, it pits people against one another. It creates fractures, and from those sort of fissions of division, it then builds upon that which it wishes to create. It's a very unnatural system, is obviously opposed to nationalism, which is a very natural system. And we see that because the national societies, not hyper-national, but, people that have an identity and they have a sort of community and a bond, they seem to be far more stable than internationalists or cosmopolitan societies, if you will. Again, we can see that from the evidence that abounds. We're living it. We're living a giant social experiment, and it seems our way of thinking is winning. But on that point, should people band together? There's this idea of archaeofuturism by Guillaume Fay. He states that the future will be a sort of agoristic, or a system of small localized farming communities again, that will build from the ashes of this societal breakdown, that we will create far greater amount of small tight-knit communities that are, essentially self-sustaining and have their own localized identities. In time, that will probably feed into a sort of larger identity as well. But yes, I think those are going to start to spring up. And if people do have like-minded individuals around them, I would strongly suggest you create homesteads and collections of homesteads. I myself I'm sort of moving away from the urban centres every year. So I just moved there, and I'm moving more and more and more into the rural areas, and I'm all the better for it. So if you can find a sort of way, myself, I don't really have the finances, so I've had to sort of find an ingenious way to circumvent that obstacle, to get out into the rural areas, and from there start to build communities. I would certainly say that would be the sort of nascent stages of this new form of nationalism.
There's something about this new, we talked about the Frankfurt School and globalism, and the kind of the way our societies are forming and how we feel the culture is moving around us. But it jars in a discordant way with something inside us. Like it doesn't sit right. It feels wrong. It makes us feel suspicious and unwelcome and disorientated. So there must be something in us that's against it, shall we say, or that's still pure or hasn't been is untouched. So what is that? Do you think that's within us, and what has put that there? What that would stand and go? No, why does the alarm? Why does the light come on the dashboard, so to speak, with this kind of Frankfurt School stuff and all this stuff? Why does it? What's left in us?
I think we have, and I mean this is just my sort of personal theory, though I have sort of logical proofs for it that I put within various videos. I really do think there is a sort of Atman, which is a Sanskrit word for a self-existing essence. We would call it the spirit or the soul. I think there is that sort of source code within us, if you will, a sort of failsafe, if we were to think about it in modern terms. And I really do think it is designed to again, once we hit that antithetical stage, that an opposing force has to meet that to then create the friction, to turn the wheel back round to what would be called sort of a normative state. So I think it's a sort of failsafe, a spiritual failsafe, if you will. But again, it's akin to that sort of occult idea of the pentacle and the pentagram, where the pentacle is God or the spirit above that of matter or the physical world. Well, the world we're living in now is the antithesis or the adversarial point of that, which is obviously the pentagram, that of matter above the spirit or the fifth element. So in essence, I think that there's something inside us that just does not find a home within that sort of thinking, that unnatural, divergent sort of thinking that we see at present within society.
So can we say that spark that's within us, could we call it our human spirit?
Yes, it is that which sort of comprises the human condition. That's what I would say, honestly.
So if we can say that, then is it reasonable to say that the kind of mandate is the eradication of that spirit, or the quenching of that spirit, or the removal of that spirit? Is it fair to say that's true?
That is what they're indeed looking to do through technological means. In previous quote quote tyrannies, just to use a general term, again, this sort of matter above spirit society, it's what they call declining societies in essence. You see this sort of wish for the dictator or the tyrant to create a system of that, again, through psychological warfare and other sort of social prompts and perspective conditioning, seeks to suppress that innate essence that one could say sort of facilitates life and spurs on the human condition in that perspective in which we experience existence itself. However, fast forward to today, and I really do think and again, that this is probably hubris on their part, but I do think they believe that they have the technological and genetic know-how to extirpate this, to cut it out from us. Because I really do think they, ironically enough, they see this essence as a sort of cancer or an obstacle by which it seems to destroy or foil their plans every time. It stops them from controlling the social, turning us totally into social organisms, like an ant or a termite. If you look at the ant hive or the termite tree, it doesn't work on mutual cooperation as human societies do. We bandy together in tribes and nations because of mutual benefit, mutual cooperation. It basically it assists us individually in a biological and also in a security sense as well. It aids in our self-preservation. However, they seek to turn us more into the sort of termite or ant colony or termitry, where we become literal social organisms, again, sort of like the hive mind, where we don't work for our own best interests. We work for the interests of the small elite, be it the queen or the royalty of the termitry or the ant colony, for the greater good. We're entirely utilitarian in that sense, I guess.
This term came up last week, husk, in the cliff. We were looking at the Kabbalah and the cliphotic spheres, and this term husk came up. And it seems to me like if you can quench the human spirit, you can remove it from the human being, then the social human person is a husk. He or she is merely like, to use the terminology of our time, the NPC, or as it was known apparently in the Frankfurt School, it was known as standardization. That was what they called what you were referring to, the bland NPC type grey character who's neither here nor there, doesn't stand out. But in that, apparently it was known as standardization in the Frankfurt School, an inert consumer devoid of free will. That's what they're looking for. But it's like this concept of a husk. It's once you empty something, it almost preempts this concept that you will then afterwards fill it with something else. So, this kind of metaphor almost of a possession, demonic possession, in the kind of Christian kind of idea comes up, that you're creating society, removing the humanity from it, and to get things onto a blank canvas that you can then insert what you want into it. So it seems to me that the Frankfurt School might have come at it from a Marxist point of view originally, that with a view to the revolution coming down the line, that you had to get rid of the old vestiges of the old society and prepare it for this new, for the new kind of Marxist, communist revolution, whatever. But like that, the globalists were preparing us for something altogether different. But as we have already said, we're using the communists or the Marxists as their useful idiots because it was lining us up for the standardization and the huskification of what is to come. And I think you've commented quite a bit on that, Silas, in your videos about some of your theories around what might be coming down the line in terms of transhumanism, etc. Would you give us a quick overview on some of that stuff, if you could?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It goes really far back. I just, before I came on the discussion here, I just wrote a section there in my book where, I've sort of traced it back to Sumeria, the sort of beginning, the embers of this intellectual thought is what you've just stated, the husk. They wish to, we have this essence within us, this primordial essence, and it's much akin to the god Marduk, who took many different forms. He rebelled against Tiamat, again the primordial creator deity. Obviously slayed this dragon or what have you, this Tiamat. And then from that, he created his new vessels to infuse within them his own creative essence, if you will. Again, NPCs. He wished to create slaves. So again, it's very similar to what's going on right now in terms of AI, cybernetics, and the modern technological contraptions that they seem to be formulating and creating and planning and have been doing for quite some time. To again, as we're discussing here, huskify society because they have to destroy the primordial vessel, if you will, primordial essence, to create a new one. This again is transhumanism. So in a way, like Harari states, they wish to become God. It's rather simple when you look at it, and it's actually terrifying. They have this idea of it as in terms of what I'm asserting, and I mean the more I look into this, I really hope it's confirmation bias, and I'm just sort of interpreting it in a biased sort of way because I mean it really is. It's not a bleak picture, but I mean it's quite a foe to go up against, to attempt to defeat. I think they will fail, but I honestly, I really, it does not bear thinking about in terms of the sort of destruction they're going to leave in their wake. Again, though, that sort of has to happen because if you look at society, there's a great amount of these NPCs that they have already created. Just through mimetic warfare, through the advent of the internet as well, which is the next stage in mimetic warfare, one could say. So they have created these NPCs rather. It's even worse than the 50s. The 50s NPCs, so to say, nowadays.
But the NPCs are, as they use the term, the standardization. If we, and I kind of don't like the term because it's very reductionist in a way and it's anti-humanist, and I feel like I'm taking on their position by using it because I'm now looking at the masses going, right, you've all become like the Borg. You're just, completely standardized, normalized, and there's no one standing out from anyone. But in a way, we can't help but make the observation because it would seem to be the case. And when we try to get our head around why is this the case, like, for any man or woman, for us to have a concept of ourselves and the world around us, like we take in information input. We say, right, I'm in this country, I'm in this historical time, I've arrived out of the 20th century, I know certain things to be true, I know roughly what the cost of living is, what my relationship is with my significant other, my family, my work colleagues, etc. But if vast elements of that input are wrong, are literally false inputs, we're living in some kind of weird schizoid state then, are we not? Where reality, we are literally in the metaverse, or a meta reality, or an alternate reality in a sense. Our consciousness has shifted away from what's actually real because we have been lied to so much. Our histories have been subverted. Our consciousness and what we rely on to tell us right from wrong and what's happening has been completely subverted. So it seems to me to be possible that actually reality is a ship that has drifted miles away and left us on a desert island somewhere, and we have no way of assimilating that information. Would you agree with that? Like that we're living in some kind of weird schizoid reality, or
Yes, I would totally agree. Totally agree. I thought for a long time, I mean, even obviously prior to the sort of wee crisis event we had a couple of years back, I remember, because I'd been looking at this stuff for about, I don't know, 6, 7 years at that point. I mean, I really started looking at this sort of stuff because, you know, I was sort of had a sort of funny feeling that there was something not quite right going on, and I could start to see the advent of a lot of these extreme social policies that we're seeing right now, the sort of birth pangs of the new state theology or state ideology, if you will, which takes many forms, but it has its own sort of doctrine or dogma that it pushes onto the society as a matter of criminal law at this point. So I do agree. Yes, we have drifted some ways away from the mean, but again, it comes back to that idea of mean reversion. I mean, it's only so far. We can only go so far, drift so far away from our course until there's a mutiny, and people with a bit more common sense take the helm once more and steer us back on course until they go mad, of course, and the cycle begins anew. That's why I would say
well,
upon that.
that's very optimistic, and I hope you're right. But one potential differing course of events would be that the further we drift away, that we develop this Stockholm syndrome with our captors, and we are kind of increasingly in this concentrically shrinking psychotic reality, which is totally divorced from what's actually happening, and we believe it more, and we become almost like more a cult member, so to speak. So I'm sorry if I sound pessimistic, but I'd rather, the terrible truth than the beautiful lie, so to speak, because I think it's important that we make a strong and kind of truthful assessment of where we're at strategically in a kind of if we're to kind of entertain this concept that we're in the middle of a psychological warfare scenario, that to
Mhm.
define as best we can where we are uh, is going to become a very important thing for us to do as individuals. And
Oh, absolutely. Oh no, I totally agree. We are in an extremely abysmal state.
let me throw a couple of quotes at you here. This is our friend Mr. Harkenheimer from the Frankfurt School, right? Quote, "We are suspicious of the very categories of useful, appropriate, productive, valuable, as those are understood in the present order." That's Mr. Harkenheimer there. He's suspicious of anything that might be deemed useful, appropriate, productive, or valuable. So you can see there's completely, they're trying to destroy, and these are like, it's important to underline these are the leading intellectuals of in the West, sort of post World War II. This is best practice. If you work in psychology, if you're a teacher, if you're in the medical profession, if you're a literary critic, if you're involved in any serious in science, any serious aspect of you know modern society, these are the people who you probably had to study these. Silas, am I correct in saying that you had to take?
Oh, definitely. Political science, any sort of, I mean, even political science in and of itself, which I've had the unfortunate displeasure of, sitting through a few lectures of that, and yes, it's rather nauseating, but that's born out of this. Again, that political science, even sociology, which again is sort of it's developed out of that as well. But sociology was really part of anthropology, again, pre sort of postmodernism. But yes, what he's stating there is what we see now. It's a denial of objective reality. seeing realism as a sort of pesky obstacle to a higher state, or a higher view, or a higher way or system of government. So again, objective reality must be done away with. Is we're starting to sort of paint this picture of postmodernism. It begins to look like what it actually is: a reductionist, anti-human, anti-life, even anti-structural, anti-truth, a weapon, psychological weapon. That's exactly what it is.
And a very effective weapon, Silas. A very effective weapon.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Because it's so enticing to especially gullible and impressionable individuals. So, sort of my ex-friend, not friends with him anymore, fortunately, but he was a quote quote political scientist. He was in university at the time studying it, and I was debating with him regarding this, and he could not come to the idea of objective truth or morality. I said to him, so if I was to kill you where you stand right now, you would not think that immoral. Your mother and father would not think that immoral of me to do. They would not look at that in a moral sense. He flat out refused to admit that, concede that point. I think he stated it would be, impractical for him to die at such a young age, and that's yeah, of course it would be impractical, but it's also immoral.
Well, as I asked you a while ago, this whole thing is clashing with something inside us, and you mentioned there's the Atman or the inner essence or the spirit. So, like, these people are denying that this exists within us, that it's impregnated in us by the divine or by creation, that there's some, this backbone, spinal element in us that is imbued deeply within us, that we didn't have to read it out of a book. We know, you know what I mean? There's that we know this is what is noble, pure, and true intrinsically within us. Like it's imbued within us deeply, and it's not something that's a construct. It's not something we gleaned from society. We're actually born innate with this. That's correct to say that? Would you agree?
Oh, I would absolutely agree. I mean, even modern philosophy, it's entirely infected modern philosophy. Most philosophers are well, I wouldn't even say pessimists. They're more nihilists, in the most precise terms. Really, they are total nihilists, and they're very depressed individuals, and they sort of wish to spread that depression to the rest of society, which is really against really what philosophy should be. And again, you're absolutely correct. It gets back to sort of what we were saying. It's a social cancer.
Would it be fair to say that the entire intellectual class or university system has been absolutely infiltrated and absolutely weaponized against us? It has turned our own greatest minds into our enemies, hell bent on our destruction. Is that too far fetched?
Oh no, absolutely. That's it. Yeah. Well, the problem is, as I was saying about my ex friend, he was just an impressionable, gullible youth, adolescent, and that's where they get them. Because prior to 25, anything you come across in terms of information, and especially if that information is saturated within your mind and put within or projected onto you in a sort of multitude, if you will, and it's constantly hammered into your mind, you will again that has some effect upon your identity and your thinking going forward. So it isn't, it's indoctrination, of course, but that's the only way they can bypass or again suppress this self-existent essence contained within all humans.
I came across a quote from Professor Anthony Sutton, who said that Mr. Granville Stanley Hall, who I believe was a psychologist, philosopher, etc., and probably has some connections with the Frankfurt School, was one of the main, was the gentleman who managed to bring in what he termed the new German experimental psychology, in brackets the Frankfurt School, which we've spoken about. He brought it into the American education system. So I'd never heard of Mr. Granville Stanley Hall, but I'm looking at a photo of him now, Silas, and this is a serious dude. On this man's right hand side is Mr. Sigmund Freud, and on his left hand side is Mr. Carl Jung. So we are dealing really with the best of the best. These are the master sorcerers, the imaginers of the new age. These are the shapers of society. These are the men, the fishers of men that understand what rolls through the minds of societies at large. We're dealing with some very, very serious characters here, are we not?
And they're well financed. Well financed.
Oh, that's the key point, yeah.
Absolutely. It goes back to what we're saying. How does this social cancer get funding to, in essence, create the first generation of indoctrinated slaves? Because again, this is gradual. This is a gradual thing that takes about a dozen generations to fully pull off. We're still in the midst of it right now, if one can believe it. But this takes a great deal of, sort of credit. So it has to come from the central banks. It's the only way they can get this sort of infinite amount of credit to thus not only capture the institutions, faculty and all, but also to re-educate the faculty as well, to thus institute their new syllabus or, plain speak, indoctrination. So, I mean, this goes all the way to the top. This is, before they captured the minds of people, they had to capture the levers of credit. So, I mean, this probably was conducted 100 years prior to what we're talking about right now, That was probably in the 1910s and the 1920s. Well, they captured primarily the levers of credit and the central and instituted central banks throughout the Western world, pretty much beginning in the early 1800s, just after the Napoleonic era. Obviously, we have the Rothschilds and everything like that, the Bank of England and what have you. But yes, they had to capture that first, so it's been a slow incremental push, like a Trojan horse, if you will, coming into the society and slowly deconstructing it, because these individuals, postmodernists, are deconstructionists. That's what they really should be termed. It's been incremental, it takes a long time, and we're sort of near the end of the line. We're on the highway to hell, and we're almost at hell. So yes, it has been a slow and methodical death by 1,000 cuts, if you will.
Well, I think one other master stroke that they pulled off in the kind of postmodernist thinking was this idea that history was completely chaotic. Nothing ever happened that was planned. It was merely a series of chaotic movements and reactions. So with this concept, you take out this idea of a master chess plan, that there's a master chess player who's operating 10 or 12 moves ahead of you. You know what I mean? So he's watching your next move, and he's saying, well, if he goes there, I've got these 5 choices. And if he moves over there, I've got these 7 moves planned. So, like, I suppose the line of thinking I adhere to is that we are indeed dealing with strategists who work along the lines of 5-year plans, 10-year plans, 50-year plans, but are thinking a long way ahead in advance. Especially, what do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this sort of lends credence or weight to what I just stated regarding this probably stems from the central banks. They had to capture those first. So therefore, I honestly, if an economist was to approach, or even a financier was to approach psychological warfare, this is how they would approach it. They are projecting predicted trajectory of where their mimetic bait or ideas are going to take society. And I think they've probably worked out maybe several sets of contingencies as well, contingency plans, in the event of unforeseen consequences or what have you. But I also believe that these individuals, I don't think they're sociologists. I honestly think they're military strategists and probably economists or financiers, because it seems to me like they've approached psychological warfare from that standpoint, where they are projecting into the future, much like an economist or a financier would, in terms of charting it and charting the effect that they're having on the zeitgeist of humanity and specifically the West.
Here's another quote from another Frankfurt School academic, Mr. Mark Hughes. Quote, "One can rightfully speak of a cultural revolution, since the pretext is directed toward the whole cultural establishment, including the morality of existing society. What we must undertake is a type of diffuse and dispersed disintegration of the system." So there you have, he's talking about this kind of a moral, attacking the moral kind of backbone of society.
They really have cemented this idea that we are to view history through the lens of, pure chaos and merely a band of incompetent leaders pitting their incompetence against each other, which, nothing can be further from the truth. It is entirely planned, and as you're seeing right there, that is him stating that there is a plan to this critique. They're not merely critiquing it, the system and these quote-quote systems of oppression, merely because they wish to understand these systems. No, it's meant to damage them. It's meant to chip away at them and demolish the entire system. So, like one would engage in a controlled demolition of a building, you hit the foundational pillars first. And from those foundational pillars, so of society, it would be morality, the family. I mean, even economics is a foundational pillar of society. As we're seeing now, the logistics as well, the logistical system. All of these things, you hit them all, tear at the fabric of society until there's nothing left but a thread. So that's exactly what he's talking about there. And yes, everything in history is planned. Nothing, I think it was Woodrow Wilson that stated, nothing occurs in politics, and we can extend that to history too, by happen chance. It's all planned meticulously.
I think me personally, I am very interested in what happened in Germany in the 20th century and what happened in Russia in the 20th century. And I think there's considerable, for anyone interested, there's considerable reading to be done to understand those historical processes as having a foothold from without those nations, and that there was a wider strategy, globalist control, essentially, which those conflicts were used as a foundation for. And it's quite scary to think of the level of mind when you think about a gentleman or gentlemen or perhaps ladies sitting around a table somewhere and strategizing on this level. So I was thinking about this earlier today, and I was trying to get inside what would make up a mind capable of doing that. And I think one would have to have had considerable experience in, for example, corporations at a national or international level. One would have had to have considerable experience in military affairs, running wars, understanding how business works around conflict and warfare, understanding how nations are shaped and built and are divided and fall and rise again around warfare and conflict. And perhaps one would have had to have considerable experience around religion, organized religion, and how religion it moves in and around society. One would have had to have considerable experience in media and the other social structures, the education system, politics, these kinds of things. So one would have had to been very, very well positioned, to use the metaphor, with an eye to see all around and to gather the information and to see the bigger picture and to understand how the table of billiards is likely to move when one strikes the ball, so to speak. So it always seems to point up the line, Silas. Am I right in saying that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this can only stem, even the point alone of, having the resources capable to even initiate this plan. So yes, it has to come from the upper echelons of society. I mean, even to get to the point of controlling the levers of credit, one has to be firstly well versed in a sort of multidisciplinary school of thought where they see many perspectives, and all of those perspectives are coalesced into a sort of philosophy of pure, unadulterated, advanced warfare. Because that's what we're talking about here. This is literally advanced warfare. It's not warfare of the conventional sense, but warfare of the sense that one cannot see, taste, nor touch it. They can only feel it in a sort of ineffable way that it can't really be pinpointed, which obviously makes it highly efficient, and as we're seeing, it is indeed highly efficient and effective. But absolutely, yes, this comes from the higher classes. By the nature of this conspiracy, I honestly believe they are probably adepts in some sense, because by these conspiracies alone, you have to again have a sort of concentric circle structure to it, where you have a vast multitude of useful idiots, to use a general or broad term, useful idiots that surround you, and then within the inner core, there can only be, you know, a handful of people coordinating and making the ultimate decisions, to which it goes out to the useful idiots on the sort of outer rims of the conspiratorial structure, if you will, or centre, the bureaucracy and what have you. And it must, and these decisions have to be put in such a way, they have to be sold to the bureaucracy in such a way to make it seem beneficial to them. So, for example, we were discussing it, that this idea of World War One and World War Two came about because, well, for example, the British Empire and their civil servant and bureaucratic class, they saw Germany as a threat, and they saw the potential loss of their position of power as a threat. Therefore, they enacted a plan that was in the best interests, or was indeed in line with the interests of the centre, the inner sanctum, the cabal, if you will, the handful of individuals that have initiated this plan and propagate it. So yes, I mean, these individuals obviously have to be the ones at the inner sanctum of the cabal, have to be extremely well versed geniuses, essentially.
Perhaps geniuses, or perhaps they have simply learned from their mistakes. That if they have been thus placed and perched on high, as it were, for extended historical periods of time, that they have learned what doesn't work, and kind of by the pattern, they're becoming more acute as time passes and more kind of surgical, and their maneuvers and the structure that they kind of have in place is more well oiled, and it's cleverer, and they have learned as such.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that sentiment as well. Yeah, they've been fighting their enemy, us, for quite some time. And obviously they had the means to do so. We see it within the Soviet Union. A great deal of probably what will occur within, one could say, the transitional, the direct transitional period, that, the event that will bring about the sort of final transformation of society. I think they probably rehearsed that within the Soviet Union and a lot of the Marxist revolutions of the 20th century. For example, we see the logistical system being sort of dismantled at this point, along with the economic system which underpins it. That was something that occurred within the Soviet Union, that food indeed was used as a weapon. And to break down the logistical system, they learned how to do that with ease within the Soviet Union, and also to maintain it, just barely maintain it, to thus facilitate a stricter control of the proletariat within the Soviet sense. For example, as well, even fascism was, and National Socialism, which was, it was linked politically to fascism. I really do believe that was probably another experiment of theirs, in terms of, well, as we see with stakeholder capitalism right now in the system that we possess right now, fascism sought a total merging of government and corporate power, as per Mussolini's definition. Del Milano, 1927, a series of speeches he gave is contained within that. And I really do think that was probably the precursor to the World Economic Forum system that is envisioned for the future. This sort of stakeholder capitalism, this quote, quote, sustainable development future, where corporations and government are entirely fused together. That the line that demarcates them as indistinct, and it's faded to the point that they fuse together and become one entity in essence.
We are their workers. We are their soldiers. We fight their wars. We consume their products. We need them to help provide us with robust economies. It seems to me that we're in a relationship with the power structure, a paternal father figure, if you will, a patriarchal or perhaps matriarchal system, but there's a parentage thing there, that we are not really free citizens, human beings free on the earth, that we are doomed to be in a relationship with these people, and they have seen that it is not fit how we are living, and that they wish to streamline us, discipline us, correct us, remodel us, reimagine our societies, etc. And this is the fate that we find ourselves in. And who are we to imagine that somehow we are free human beings? That we should have free will and should exist how we want to. Is it a bit presumptuous of us to want these things, given this kind of relationship we have with the structure?
I would say for the majority of people at this point, well, firstly, I don't think they have even the ability to to answer that question, or even to pose the question to themselves in a sort of if they did have a miracle of self-reflection, even for a brief moment. But if I was to answer that question, I would say free will really has to be nurtured. It has to be permitted or allowed to develop within the child. And obviously with compulsory education, it's sort of beaten out of us. So therefore, again, well, not beaten out of us, it's more suppressed. Again, that self-existent essence is suppressed within us. That's done through various means. The suppression of creativity being one of them within compulsory educational systems. And furthermore, sort of standardization of thinking. Again, this brings to the fore the idea or the concept of mimetic warfare. But I don't think it's presumptuous to want that. Honestly, I would say that they don't really act as a parent, though many see them as a parent. I think they more act as a sort of an amoral demon, if you will. A parent wouldn't starve their child to bring them into line. A parent wouldn't cling on to their child, confusion, chaos, and engender an entire collapse of their rigidity, of their identity. That which keeps them together, that which gives them a spine in a spiritual and mental sense. I don't think a parent would take that away. I really do see them as a sort of a more demonic entity.
Perhaps a parent who hated their child somehow, some kind of psychotic
Oh yes, actually yes,
character.
yes, like Cruella de Vil or something. Yes,
Exactly.
or like Cinderella, the evil stepmother. Yes, probably that. Yes.
So do you think they possibly just hate society? They've grown to hate the masses, and it's just the great unwashed, as it were, that they have posed them problems time immemorial, and they're vast inconvenience, and it's that they're trying to come up with a better system for management.
I think
as it were.
I think the new generation of them do hate us. I think the older generation are probably indifferent. They're just merely following a. I honestly think it is a unifying religion that binds this cabal. Therefore, I believe that they're following some sort of divine purpose, if you will. Be that whatever it may. I've asserted potentials on what it could be. I feel strong in those right now, till obviously I find evidence to the contrary. But yes, I think the older generation of this sort of inner sanctum were probably indifferent to us. That doesn't mean they liked us. They still found us a major annoyance, but I don't think they were fervent in their wish to eradicate us. It seems like there's been a real stark shift in the last 20 years to the point where the elite really do seem to hate us, and they make it blatantly clear. I mean, there's many of those sort of Marie Antoinette moments you see from Biden and even Kamala Harris and, even Boris Johnson as well, discussing the idea of, for example, Ukraine. They state, any price we will pay. Just think of what the Ukrainians are going through. Higher gas and higher petrol and fuel prices. It's a price to pay for democracy. And I've noticed they've been using the terms free world and democracy quite a lot, defending the free world and democracy. And it seems to me they're using it in an almost sarcastic tone. I don't even think they used free world and democracy as ubiquitously as they did the height of the Iraq War or, in 9/11. They seem to be using it to a far greater extent now, this idea of the free world and democracy, in a sort of sarcastic tone currently. Obviously, I think they enjoy in the media right now, this probable new generation of elite. I think they enjoy tormenting those of us that are in the know, and even the unwashed masses, as they would see them. Yes, I do think they sort of hate us now, and there is a hubris that I think has infected their thinking. But obviously, I'm not privy to everything that goes on with them. I can only make a generalized assumption based on small snippets of data that I managed to glean.
Kind of remind you of a rock band that have had 2 or 3 difficult albums and have finally hit the golden vein, and they're you know what I mean. They're hitting the ball out of the park now, and they're full of swagger, and their old fans don't recognize them anymore. You just kind of, but I don't know, man. Yeah, very interesting. Any concluding final thoughts on it, or?
No, I would just say, I mean, postmodernism is another branch of this clipotic tree. So we must be aware of it, and we must be aware of its pervasive and perfidious influence upon society from now and going forward, and as it has been in the past, from about the time of the sexual revolution, though it predated that. So I people just have to be cognizant of that.
Just on the 1960s, and back to our friend Mr. Marcuse rather, from the Frankfurt School, wrote a book called Eros and Civilization, and he was promoting sexual liberation as a kind of to get rid of the old order, etc., which led to the 1960s. And came across a quote there recently from the second US president, Mr. John Adams. He said, "We have no constitution which functions in the absence of a moral society." So, like, if you take it that if you can undermine the moral order in society, you have then you have this kind of political control. It's E. Michael Jones' catchphrase: "Sexual liberation is political control." So there's a lot of this stuff, this dialectic stuff, which was, I believe, the old kind of communist thing was along class struggles. So they just maneuvered that mechanism into the West and looked for new kind of minority kind of struggle areas, and had this kind of the tyranny of the minority, that the West now was in a state of total hypocrisy after World War II, really, and we all were kind of closet Nazis, and we should hang our heads in shame, and the whole thing was going to go down the pipeline, down the tubes, unless we stood up for this the small guys. So we ended up with whoever was in political correctness, multiculturalism, queer theory, all these kinds of stuff that were ostensibly on paper looked like, yeah, that's to do with rights, sign me up, I want everyone to be happy, but really was to do with promoting division in society. So it was quite clever.
Well, what I'm seeing now, and I'm actually, I was meaning to bring this up earlier on in the discussion. My memory fails me now in old age, but yes, I mean, even Foucault discussed this, and this ties in with our idea surrounding, they've sort of had a test run of all this that they're doing right now, and have done within the West. Many people don't realize, but prior to the revolution within Soviet Russia, there was a sort of free love within the air, if you will. There was a real rebellion of the youth. Again, it broke down the societal structure. What did we see post-Dayton in the revolution? Well, that was all banned. In Romania, you could actually be imprisoned for what they termed legally is basically the Romanian term translated to degeneracy or deviancy. You could be imprisoned all the way up to the 90s or to the fall of it. I mean, people don't realize this, but the communist societies, post-Dayton revolutions, were extremely, hyper conservative in terms of them instating and maintaining a rigid moral system within the society. Obviously, they'd already used it as the sort of wrecking ball against the society, and they didn't want that same wrecking ball being used against them, so they outlawed it. But yes, Michel Foucault discussed all of this within his book History of, forget the title now, but yeah, it's basically a history of sex, if you will. Discusses within that and how it can be used for political control. He discusses in that this idea of biopower, or in French, biopouvoir, where he discusses the idea of biopolitical or biopower as the practices of the modern governmental institutions in subjugating and controlling, firstly, the physical bodies of the masses, and also, in turn, obviously, the mental faculties. I mean, even to a deeper sense, he doesn't state this, but infers it, a sort of spiritual control of them as well. You know, obviously through destroying the morality of the system. Yes, so I mean, everything we're seeing right now is based off that. It leads to destruction of the family unit, because they realized early on, if people are promiscuous, and I mean to a point where you become completely numb, you know, comfortably numb, as Pink Floyd would say, to this inundation of dopamine or pleasure, and you begin to forget your spiritual or a higher form, that which is not animalistic, or that which is above the sort of bestial realm, the realm of, you know, physicality and matter. By bringing that to the fore through obviously promiscuity and a sort of sexual blasé culture, you begin to create husks, people that are literally comfortably numb, because they've become so apathetic due to an over inundation of pleasure, and an inability to form a strong family unit. Again, it speaks to Orwell's 1984, where they discussed this idea of the anti-sex league, where one has no, because obviously sex leads to bonding with the partner. Therefore, if one breaks that down via promiscuity, which sort of distorts one's moral and spiritual and social compass in terms of, you know, sex, then, and creating a family, then the person will become loyal to the regime. Again, they will become atomized. They'll become loyal to the regime's ideology. They will become more in tone with that. The regime will become again, as you were saying, the parent or the surrogate spouse, if you will, in a sort of sick sense. But yes, this is what the postmodernists were all discussing. I mean, obviously Lyotard even discussed it as well. A lot of this is born out of 1960s France, and there's a serious sickness that seems to be pervasive with this. We saw it within France, within the postmodern movement. It's a sort of push or advocacy for paedophilia, and I mean extreme sexual deviancy. And again, that is all birthed out of moral relativism, which seems to be a sort of fundamental pillar of postmodernism. So yes, and again, it's all, as you're saying, it's born around the euphemism of rights and civil liberties, and, you know, all of these nice sounding words.
I can remember like being in university here in Ireland, and these names, Michel Foucault, Jean-Paul Sartre, you know, some of these names like were like, you know, they were on the shelves in the library, and these were the academics. These were, for example, if you were studying English literature, and you had you had the bad luck of having to write an essay in literary criticism or something like that, you had to be sort of up with these names, you know what I mean, and you had to read the stuff and at least be able to refer to them. You know, I was no great academic as such, but like, you know, we had to know who they were and what the general thinking was. But like, I recently became aware that in 1977, some of these names signed a petition to the French Parliament that was calling for the abrogation of the age of consent. So it was about lowering the age of consent down to the age of 15. And, you know, some of these names, then I subsequently found out, like Foucault, were pederasts. He was involved in, how do you say this stuff gently? You know what I mean? He's involved with young boys, which I'm sure So but these are like the elite, if you will, the elite, the intellectual elite are, how do you say, moderate moral degenerates by most people's standards, And back to our earlier kind of point about the Frankfurt School originating from the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Goethe himself, if I'm not mistaken, was also a pederast. So it starts getting all a bit like, coincidental, shall we say, that you have this kind of stuff going on, and it's like there's a malaise there, like, by most right-thinking people's minds, there's a kind of a malaise down through the middle of this kind of stuff. And it's very, very, very concerning, and it's hard to see. Well, one can kind of see where the kind of thing might be going. Like, obviously everybody wants everybody to feel comfortable, right? Nobody wants to be judged, etc. So we have a kind of an automatic moral setting, which is like, if you're doing your thing in the comfort of your own home, I don't judge you. More power to you. Enjoy yourself. I hope you don't, once you don't hurt anyone or yourself or whatever, it's not an issue. But it seems that this default kind of thing within us to be accepting of people is being manipulated, and millimeter by millimeter, we're expected to accept perhaps more and more, which we would consider morally questionable. And if it ties into this idea, this postmodernist weaponization of psychological warfare, the worry is now that this is a gun pointed at us, at our moral sensibility, with a view to slowly detangling our society, as it were. So now it's a concern. Now it becomes a big concern for us. And I think obviously there are intelligent people within the gay community, for example, who must have these concerns. For example, that the movements which they are supposedly find themselves signed up to may have an ulterior agenda. So I think, I'd like to hear a voice from the gay community who would come out and say, look, I'm gay. I don't have a problem with being gay. No one around me has an issue with being gay. However, this representative body, I don't want anything to do with it. It's concerning for me. You know what I mean? I'm not sure what the real agenda is here, but it certainly doesn't represent me. But I haven't heard that voice from the gay community. For example, and that's not to say that people want to join whatever they want to join and feel represented. That's great, but my concern anyway is that there are other agendas at play, and it's not just with what I've just mentioned. It's also with a variety of what you might call dialectic issues, such as climate, race relations, perhaps medical concerns, such as such as we've recently experienced, etc., etc. So it's to find out, by all means, we want everybody to feel good about themselves and accepted into society. But are there agendas there by who's purporting to represent you? And it comes back to the nationalist thing. There's the great example of it in Germany in the 1940s. You had supposedly a representative entity arising that was going to solve the national problems, who turned out to be, we suspect, heavily co-opted, if not an agent of those same forces. But as the fella says, they went for the bait. The German public at the time, seemingly, an element of them went for the bait. And the rest is history, as they say. So I think we're living in a time, Silas, where you have to be extremely cautious about somebody who rings your doorbell and says, I'm your representative. I'm glad to have found you. Please sign here. And I think we're in a time where we need to ask these questions. This kind of psychological warfare, social conditioning is happening in real time around us. And I think the average thinking person, who's at home, who might be listening to this, needs to ask the questions, and I also think like that You know, people have this thing of waking the masses up. Why don't the masses? I think that's completely irrelevant. I think if you've got a consciousness that's within you, as you said, Silas, we are in an atomized time where we are quite atomized, we're quite split up, and it's up to each of us on our own to formulate our own consciousness gently, take it in, you know, chew the fat with it, see what's right and what's wrong, and form our own psychological kind of standing with regard to the world around us. And I think that's one of the first, if you will, strategic things we can do in this kind of psychological warfare territory, is to assert, where am I? What is real? What's not? What's important? What's north, south, east, west?
That's it. That is the antidote to the postmodern indoctrination. Most of us alive today pretty much all of us alive today have went through some degree of that. That is the antidote to it. People call it spirituality, but it's really understanding, what is truth? What am I? People ask individuals, who are you? And they will reel off their sort of social status. But who really are you? Who are you? What are you? What is your essence? Not what you do. Who are you? So I think cultivating, firstly, your mind, cultivating the understanding of your environment, your social and cultural environment, understanding it and understanding, firstly, its misgivings and understanding the sort of pitfalls that have been placed there by forces that are out with our view, so to say. They're hidden in plain sight. But on the point of, that sort of final crossing of the Rubicon, and I've put up a few videos. There was one I just put up on BitChute there called "The Truth About Aeromod," and it's this individual. It seemed to be it was the same thing that he was pushing, like a sort of mimetic warfare, like a bot throughout BitChute and also other platforms. Well, it seems like another individual has came into the comments section defending this abhorrent individual, that this file essentially, an advocate for it, and he had the exact same arguments as him. And again, it centers around, well, civil liberties and all, and they also, it's semantic shifts that they use. This is what postmodernism's all about: changing the definitions of words, changing the perspective upon said words. So, for example, morality, they say that they are moral rather than taking the position that they are immoral, and that they are the victims rather than obviously the oppressors or abusers. So again, it's gaslighting. That's what it's all based around.
They're grooming society.
Exactly. That's exactly it. What happens when they change the definition or change the legal boundaries of the age of consent? What does that actually do? Or they disband it? What does that do? Well, what it does is, in essence, it destroys the definition or the parameters around the definition of a child. There's no longer children legally or politically or in any other cultural or social sense. It dispels the definition of child, so everyone is merely de facto an adult. And if that's the case, and a child has the mental capacity, because that's what we're talking about here, the mental capacity to not just have consent, but also to have their own agency in a political, economic, financial, and a vocational sense as well. So it brings in to the fore child labour, the most vulnerable and, I would say, impressionable people in our society. They now become political and economic players. I mean, it's so sick. And they'll obviously, the government may be extracting taxes from them because now they have the mental capacity to buy their own house, drive. In America, to buy a gun, why not? To work.
It's an attack on innocence itself, which is probably the most cynical thing you can think of, and is an absolute declaration of war, is it not? It is a declaration of war.
Absolutely, and it's an
I
attack
mean,
on the family, because the family
mm,
structure, the sort of socio-economic hierarchy of the family, pardon, is set up in such a way that it's designed around sustaining children. But if children no longer exist, if children now have their own agency, children can work, buy their own house within this sort of quote quote first world service economy, unlike the industrial economies of the past where children were sent down the pit and what have you. They can now, they would be able to be basically exploited by employers And I would call it exploitation. These weirdos in the postmodern circles wouldn't, but yes, I mean, there would be no point of the family unit anymore.
But there's certain key things that hold up the common sense of what's right and wrong. And I think if you disintegrate, if you attack innocence in this way, you are actually by default, there's a hidden agenda where you're attacking the common sense of righteousness in society itself, so that the average person's psyche, consciousness actually starts to disintegrate because they're looking at a world around them where all this crap is creeping in, and it's detangling what they believe is right or wrong, and all of a sudden then they feel completely isolated and undermined, and that they're surrounded by bullies, and you know what I mean. So you can see where this kind of cynicism will creep in, and absolute defeatism, and how powerful a weapon that would be. So that you might you might say that may not even be the objective, this attack on innocence for its own sake, but there's a wider, all these things have a wider strategic agenda, which is, the destruction of the common sense, as it were, of right and wrong, and removing that backbone. That thing that I asked you earlier on in the conversation, you used that word, Atman, that inner essence, that spirit. It's all attempting to extinguish it, to lessen its power, its focus, and to bring us back down into that kind of husk state where we're just empty, kind of, what's their term that they use here, the standardized, inert consumers, devoid of free will, devoid of consciousness, full of apathy and just inertia. And it sounds rather depressing, I'm sure, but I think it shouldn't be depressing. I think for anyone who's listening, it should serve as a preparation. It should serve to set your jaw and your back straight and get ready. I think we should be prepared for this. I think we should be aware of this. We should be learning about this. We should be speaking only to those who will listen, or who are prepared. If you have to find someone on the internet, or you have to talk to someone about this, if you're in the university system and you see yourself surrounded by proxy Marxist literature, or Frankfurt School academics, don't, perhaps raise it with your classmates. Don't be afraid to stand up and debate it, to explain who these people are, what they're trying to do, that you don't necessarily follow you don't follow with the program, etc., etc. Perhaps you can use it as an essay title. Maybe you can redirect the question back at your professor and say, look, this is, as far as I'm concerned, this is having a huge destructive effect on our societies. I am footnoting the material. I am making an intellectual attack on it. It's well founded, and I hope you'll be willing to read the material, and perhaps there's some way we can gradually raise awareness around people that this is something that has seeped in to our society by osmosis, in a glacial kind of movement, millimeter by millimeter. It has seeped in, and we need to be aware of it. We need to be aware of how modern culture is influencing this stuff, media, etc. How it has seeped in through generations. And it's sad to say, Silas, but we're probably looking at the guts of a lost generation somewhere. Maybe in the current era, we're looking at a lot of people who have been born into this kind of stuff and this way of
Oh,
thinking.
you're absolutely correct. I mean, everything you just said there, I agree with every sentiment. My ex, one of my exes, she was specialising in molecular and cellular biology. But anyway, she used in a essay, she took some sort of what they would call in America a sort of credit or a minor or what have you class, just to sort of bump up our our credits or our grade or what have you. And she used the term, and I mean it was a hard science class, but she used the term in one of her essays because she knew the lecturer was pretty much like a hardline feminist, again postmodernist, useful idiot. She used the term just nonchalantly, feminist geopolitics, which I asked her, I said, what does that mean? She says, it means absolutely nothing. And the lecturer circled it and says, I really like this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The lecturer doesn't even know what it means. It's just a buzzword. It's like a composite buzzword. It plays to our ideological zealotry.
Yeah.
But these individuals, literally, that's all they are, is zealots. What you're looking at is a new theology that, like the zealots of old, they literally stand on nothing. They're not standing on truth, they're standing on narrative. And it's quite easy to deconstruct this rather flimsy narrative because it is, as I said, self-referential. It's all based on circular logic, things that just don't make sense.
We could make some sort of understanding, at least, if we said, right, the Frankfurt School merely are people who are trying to reinvent Marx and are at heart people who believe in communism. And we might say, we might not agree with communism, but we might at least understand them that that's their political ideology of preference. And if they may advance it in the world, more power to them. You know, that's their business. They have a right to believe in what they believe in. We may clash with them or disagree with them, etc., etc. But they do ultimately have a right to determine what political system they'd like to live in. But I think we're making the strong point that that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that this entire Frankfurt School ideology has been appropriated by a hidden hand with another agenda in place, which is this, as we say, huskification of society, this creation of morally bewildered, confused, directionless place. Which I think was it Brzezinski who said it's the first people who get shot are the communists. They are the ardent communists, those who ardently subscribe to the political ideology. Because when they find out I beg your pardon, what was the name?
Yuri Bezmenov.
You're right, Silas. Thank you for that. Yuri Bezmenov. He said that the first ones who get the bullet are the actual communists. So the Frankfurt School gentlemen and academics will be lined up and they will be dispatched. And they'll be like, well, what the hell is going on? We did exactly what... Yeah, you've done your job and now it's our turn. Now we're in. And then you're dealing with globalism. Then you're dealing with Orwellian society, as is envisaged, as we suspect. We hope we're wrong, but that's the wolf that reveals itself.
The sort of ironic thing is what they're actually promoting. The end goal of the end system, if you will. Again, once, as you're saying, once these useful idiots are dispatched of, because as I stated, the system that they envision isn't a quote inclusive and sustainable system of equality, and that's not the system that they wish for. Those are just buzzwords, sort of a distortion of the truth. There's that scene in that Tom Cruise movie. I was rewatching it. Collateral, he's a hitman, and he shoots this person. He falls out the window, and Jamie Foxx says to him, "You just killed that person." And Tom Cruise replies, "No, I didn't kill him. I shot him. It was the bullet and the fall that killed him."
Yeah.
So it's this sort of, it's a distortion of truth. You know what I mean? It's using truth in a devious way. It's exactly what they do. It's the same thing with the civil liberties. Oh well, it's all about civil liberties, and we've got to create an inclusive. And what does that even mean? An inclusive and equal? What? It's buzzwords. It's what all political ideologies in essence do. I mean, even the National Socialists and Soviets had their political slogans, if you will. Workers of the world unite. While Marx is a middle class exploiter who didn't pay his housekeepers and sired bastard children with them. you know, Discussing about the exploitation of the working class. I mean, Jesus, talk about hypocrisy. The guy never done a day's work in his life.
I just wonder, have we done any kind of justice to this? Like this postmodernist Frankfurt School critical theory, this insertion. Like, I think it's important to state on the macro, right, that society itself has an intellectual class, if you will. And they are the thinkers of their day, be they the Socrates of their day or whoever, the Jean-Paul Sartre. But your society that you're living in really has an intellectual class. I don't want to use the word elite, but it has an intellectual class that functions as sort of the brain or the mind, spirit thinking of that society. And they go through their own little wars of fighting around what they believe to be true or real or whatever. But like that this almost dogmatic line of thinking has just risen to the fore in the West and is our kind of the foundation of our modern intellectual thought, and it seems to have permeated society because it's taken in through the university system, which in turn teaches the I suppose the upper middle class typically or teaches the intellectual elite of that society. So all the teachers, all the medical people, all the media people, the creative people, in so many different fields, writers, artists, are all coming through this system. They're coming through this schooling, and not only that, but they're bombarded then with further input from just regular media around them, and also from what we might loosely, to use Gramsci's term, the common sense. What the person beside them is saying. What is the culture within their class? Within their cross section of society. What do their peers talk about? What do they take on to be normative? What do they aspire to? What do they tolerate as being good, bad, and indifferent, etc.? So it's like the whole thing gets permeated and attacked and shaped and molded and chipped away at, and it's very difficult, I think, for myself included, for most people to get any kind of an idea around how would a process like this be possible, or what would it entail. But it doesn't seem to be that complex if you can sort of infiltrate the intellectual elite. You get your writers and your thinkers, your psychologists, philosophers, economists, etc. Get them all dancing to this beat, and they will in turn shape the mind, brain, spirit of that society. And you can thereby then you have huge aspect to shape it, like a hand on the pottery wheel, when they spin the clay. I hope we did the subject a little bit of justice. It's a huge subject, it's an intimidating subject in its own way, because it's just very vast,
Oh yeah, as I said at the beginning, it's really hard to define. It's a nebulous concept, and it's basically created as such to hide its hidden influence within society, I think.
Well, I hope we did a little bit of justice, or some justice.
For justice's sake.
Yeah.